Well, hello everyone, and welcome to I guess, the BCB seminar, or IBEST-IMCI Seminar for this week. I have the honor of doing the introduction for Terry, which I'm very excited about, although I'm not going to make it very long or anything like that. But I have been, now that I've notified, I'm going to close my various programs here so you stop hearing all the beeps and whirs and buzzes. I think I've been collaborating with Terry now for, I think we're in our 6th year or thereabouts, which is hard to believe because it's gone very quickly. And it's been amazing. I've loved every minute of it. And it began shortly after a sabbatical of mine where I wandered sheepishly into his office to ask him about whether he thought an evolutionary video game would be a fun project to work on. I did that because I knew that he had been thinking along those lines for a long time and had actually made some interactive evolutionary simulations online. And it's my favorite story to tell about that moment is I walked into Terry's office and sort of pitched this evolutionary game idea to him. And the next day he came up to my office and he showed me on his computer, he said, "You mean like this?" And he'd actually built one, a prototype. You know, I was just stunned at how quickly he could do these kinds of things. And then we began collaborating, and he's become a really good friend, and just the best collaborator I could ever ask for, because he reins me in when I get too kooky. But I would just like to tell you, so for the past 5 years, we've gotten a series of grants, we've built a game studio, we've published 2 games and worked on many other projects. And if you go and look at those games and all of the sort of crazy scientific lore and weird stuff that's in there, that's really exciting and awesome and just kooky, that's all him. Everybody thinks it's me because I'm the crazy one outwardly, but internally, he's the guy that comes up with all the sci-fi ideas and all of the really good game ideas. It's really fun to be able to sit beside him and do all of that kind of stuff. But what's exciting about today, I think, is that you will get to see all of the research stuff that Terry does. I think he's going to have a lot of stuff in there that's not video games. That's all about all his accomplishments in evolutionary computation and artificial intelligence and all of those kinds of things. So I think it's going to be a really, really fun seminar. So if you get a chance to collaborate with Terry, I would like to invite you to do that, but I don't want you to do it because I want them all to myself. So don't do it. So anyway, with that, Terry, take it away.
Okay, thank you. I guess after that introduction, I should say 2 things. One of which is in terms of the game development and the crazy ideas, that's at least 50-50. I think I could say the exact same thing. I have these ridiculous ideas and Barry reins me in. And the thing that we've learned is, yes, you can do a prototype really quickly, but making an actual game takes a really long time. So, sometimes frustratingly so. Cool prototypes, and then it takes forever to do the game. I'm not going to talk so much about games today. I guess maybe half of this, I've got 2 examples, and one is sort of the more practical research side, and the other is at least shading over into the more fun game side, although still research. So let me share some slides here. Make sure that I have the right screen. There we go. Can everybody see that?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, excellent. So this is sort of an introduction to and a discussion very generally of some of the applications of genetic programming, which is sort of, I guess, my very narrow area of expertise. And so when I say very narrow, start with a kind of a hierarchy. So very broadly, I work in artificial intelligence, which is this notion of programs that perform tasks, I'm going to say, that normally require a person. We could probably spend hours, in fact, in computer science. It's regular to spend years arguing about the definition of artificial intelligence. So I'll leave it at that. Machine learning is sort of a subset of artificial intelligence programs that learn. And then within that, within machine learning, evolutionary computation is that idea of learning, but via evolution. So on a computer, an evolutionary process that allows the computer to learn things. And then within evolutionary computation, there's yet another sort of even narrower focus, which is genetic programming, which is what I want to talk about. And that's the idea that in particular, what evolve are programs. So imagine the idea of computer programs that are undergoing evolution. That's what I want to talk about. And it helps, I think, in terms of thinking about evolution to look at it, to make sure that you're looking at it sort of the same way I am as a computer scientist. So I think about evolution in terms of what are the components that I need to put into a program to get evolution to occur. And again, probably like artificial intelligence, we could discuss for a long time, well, what are the real components of evolution? But these are the ones that are useful from a programming standpoint. So I'm going to say we need a population, right? So evolution works on populations. We need some sort of selection based on fitness. So this is our survival of the fittest. We need inheritance or some form of reproduction. So if an individual is selected because it has above average fitness, it needs its offspring should inherit its traits, right? If you don't have inheritance, those traits get lost and evolution can't occur. And we need some variation. So if offspring are perfect clones of their parents with no variation, then evolution quickly dead ends. It converges on one particular solution. So we need variation. So mutation or maybe sexual reproduction where two individuals contribute to offspring. And I say two, and one of the fun things about doing evolution with computer science models is, you know, if you want 4 or 5 individuals to all contribute their genomes, you can certainly set that up. And then time, lots and lots of time. And I should say, if anybody has questions along the way, feel free to, you know, raise your hand or unmute yourself and holler or type them into chat. I'm happy with all of those. Okay, any questions so far?
How do you get a program to reproduce with another program? Is that like, are you going to explain that later?
I will. I mean, that's an excellent question, but right. Yeah, imagine I've got 2 Python programs and now I'm going to get them to reproduce. That is a sticky question. So I will get there. Okay,
cool. Thanks.
So I want to start with a simpler example and a bit of an odd one, which is placing windmills. And I picked this a little bit arbitrarily, but also in part because it's not necessarily something you'd normally associate with evolution. But if you've driven up to Spokane, probably not as many people have done that recently. You pass all of the windmills off by the side of the road. It turns out their placement just relative to each other is pretty important. If you line them all up in a row, it turns out the first windmill would sort of absorb some of the wind energy and the other ones won't get it. So you want to disperse them, but especially on the Palouse, you'd like to also put most of them near the top of the hills because the wind's a little stronger, but we've only got so many hilltops. So optimally placing all of those windmills for a wind farm can affect the efficiency reasonably significantly. And if it's a farm that's going to be out there for 50 years, a small change in efficiency adds up to a lot more energy over time. And so what we want to do in a case like this is figure out what is the optimal placement, and optimizing things is something that evolution works well at. as long as we can take this problem and represent it in an evolutionary framework. And so if we want to think in terms of our components, we need individuals that we can make a population and apply evolution to. So the trick is to say, here's, well, let me find my laser pointer. There we go. So here's my windmills. Each one has sort of an XY position. So in a case like this, I can imagine saying that an individual, like an individual creature, if you will, is represented by a genome, sort of like DNA, but in this case, it's a series of XY positions. So this array of XY positions defines where I want to put my windmills, but we could also think of it as a genome for an individual. So it's both a solution to the problem, not necessarily the optimal solution, and a genome. And from that point of view, we can say, okay, here's two different individuals representing different placements of windmills. They each have their own DNA, if you will, their own genome. And the fitness is something like how efficient is this at generating wind energy. And to measure that fitness in a case like this, we need some sort of a aerodynamic simulator that calculates, you know, the average wind speed and average wind direction. And those models do exist. And so this is a problem that I've seen. I haven't tackled it myself, but other researchers have applied evolution to this notion of placing windmills for a windmill farm optimally. So the idea is we have our individuals with their genomes, and then evolutionary computation sort of more generally comes into a couple of different categories. I'll talk about the generational model. So create a population of potential solutions. So I'm just have this as colored bars. Think of each of these as a windmill placement solution. Or if you prefer, think of each of these as a genome. Run each one through our simulator to figure out how efficient it is. Assign it an efficiency value, i.e. a fitness value. Select based on that fitness, I'll do pairs, so 2 to represent parents. Apply for sexual reproduction. In evolutionary computation, we sort of refer to it as crossover, which is probably an abuse of the terminology, but close enough. So the notion here is you can sort of see this part of the genome gets copied over here, and this part gets copied over here. So there's sort of a crossing, an exchange of DNA, and then I've just put it in its blue, a representation of a mutation. And in our windmill example, that would be sort of take some of the windmills in this quadrant and replace them with the equivalent windmills from the other solution. So we're sort of mixing and matching solutions. And then put it in a new population. Repeat this process until our new population is full. And so these are individuals that clearly are based on the initial ones, but with some mutations and some variation. And then take our old population, replace it with the new one, and repeat the process. Make sense? Any questions? Okay. And in the interest of, sort of being fair, it's worth pointing out that most of the time when you do these sorts of crossover and mutation operations, you're going to end up with a worse solution, right? Making a random change is probably going to make things worse. Taking 2 solutions and sort of exchanging pieces is probably going to make things worse. But if we have a big enough population, some of those solutions will be better, and we'll use selection to sort of focus on those better ones. So I always like to point that out. There's sort of no magic happening. It's random. Things generally get worse, but some of them are better, and it's selection that focuses on those. And this is sort of overly simplified. Really, my population should be not 5 individuals, but 500 or 5,000 individuals.
So how do you decide the rate of mutation and crossover decisions?
There are some general guidelines that people tend to use, but a lot of it is trial and error.
Okay.
Yep. So, you know, as an example for mutation, typically it's set to be only mutate 2 values on average. So if I've got 50 windmills in my farm, I probably only want to move 1 or 2 of them each time as a mutation. If you think of a mutation as maybe shifting a windmill.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
But again, that's a pretty rough rule of thumb. And there's been a lot more work than maybe is justified in sort of people arguing about what is the best rate. And I say that in part because a different problem, a different rate is probably going to be optimal. And in part, you don't really hope to find the exact best mutation rate. You just run it a whole bunch and wait for a good solution.
Okay. Makes sense. Thank you.
Good. And I should say, I sort of skipped over selection. Selection is the same thing. There's lots of different ways to do selection, and the focus there is always to prefer the most fit individuals, but not only pick those. So if I had a population of 500 individuals, I wouldn't want to take the best 2 and just say, you get to be the parents every single time. So there are different sort of stochastic measures that favor good individuals, but also give poorer individuals a chance to be selected.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is to balance maintaining a fairly diverse population while also moving, if you think about it in terms of a search space, moving towards better solutions.
I see.
Mm-hmm. Does that help?
Yes, thank
Great.
you.
Good. Other questions? Okay, so I've kept this kind of vague, right? My individuals are represented by little colored bars. We can represent solutions in all sorts of different ways. So for the windmill example, it's sort of a vector of maybe integer values or maybe real values. Now, as a computer scientist, I like the idea of I could take those integers and represent them as binary numbers. But it turns out different forms of evolutionary computation, lots of different representations of solutions have been developed. And the one I want to talk about for genetic programming is programs. So I sort of have that in my list. And so for genetic programming, individuals are programs. So I have a couple examples of fairly poor Python code here. So here's a little Python code to say, calculate the average of a bunch of data. So for every D in data, add it to the average, divide by the length. Here's another piece of Python code. I forget what it does. I think it builds a list just by appending items. And so the idea from before is we're going to, if these are 2 individuals that are programs, we're going to take them, we're going to do some sort of crossover between them, we're going to do some mutations. And the question that was raised is, how in the world is that going to work? Right? And so that is in fact the question I have here. How is that going to work? And the answer is really badly. Right? As you can probably imagine, what you end up with is a whole lot of syntax errors and a big mess. So the solution is to represent programs not in the way we're used to doing it, but actually as trees. And this seems a little odd, and I don't know if this is an example that will help or not, but if we think about like English, you can diagram a sentence. Can't imagine anybody has done that in years. But the idea is a sentence has phrases that go with it, and then those become individual terms in the sentence. And you can recognize a valid sentence from an invalid sentence based on whether or not it follows the rules of grammar that builds up this trait. turns out the exact same thing is true for programming languages. Every programming language has a grammar that defines what a valid tree is. So when you get a syntax error, it's because your program has been run through a grammar analysis and basically said, oh, this program doesn't meet the rules of the grammar, and in particular, here's where that problem is. And so you can take a program and turn it into a tree. Now, this is not a full program, but it's a statement sequence can have a while loop, and a while loop should have a condition and a body, and the condition should have some sort of a comparator, and the comparator should have either variables or constants, and so forth. So programs can be represented by trees. And the advantage to this, I'm going to not do full programs because that is still pretty complicated, is if we look at a sort of a simpler tree, and quite often, you know, it's even just the mathematical part of a tree, what you'll notice for a mathematical expression represented as a tree is we have sort of internal nodes, I put circles around them, so things like plus and minus, and then leaf nodes, which are things like the input, so maybe an X or a 7. And we can take that idea and go a little further with a programming language and say, well, maybe I have a do loop, and this branch is the conditional part, and this is the body of the do loop. 6 is not a very interesting body for a do loop, right? This will, I don't know, print 6 over and over again, but it is at least a valid tree if it sticks to the rules of the grammar. And the advantage to this is, imagine we have 2 trees and we want to do reproduction. So that was the big question, is, well, how in the world are we going to do things like reproduction and mutation? Well, here are 2 valid trees, I'm going to say, and they're valid because my internal nodes are circles and my leaf nodes are squares. And so within some simplified grammar, that may be enough to make these grammatically relevant. And if I do crossover by exchanging branches, I still have a grammatically valid tree. And the idea is sort of, again, if we go back to English sentences, if you have a grammatically valid English sentence and you want to swap the noun phrase with the noun phrase from a different sentence, you still have a grammatically valid sentence. It might not mean a whole lot, depending on what noun phrase you swapped in, but it is still valid. And the same idea applies to programs and allows us to avoid just generating lots and lots of syntax errors. Similarly, if we're a little careful about our mutation, so if I have a leaf node, I'll limit my mutation to other appropriate structures there. Then at least I avoid the problem of all I have is 5,000 programs that won't run. Good questions?
Hi, Terry. Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So when I took your course, we did this in class, and we were mutating and crossing over the whatever genetic sequence, sort of like a sequence that we determined. But you're talking about mutating or crossing over the actual program itself, not an object like a sequence, right?
Sort of. I mean, in this case, we would have a program that contains within it a list of subprograms.
Right, yeah. So, okay, yeah, this is fascinating. Yeah, great, thank you.
Okay. And really, typically, they are not, I mean, I'll be fair, they're not complete programs. It would be a little fairer to say they're executable structures. So it's a structure that I can evaluate as if it was a program.
Right, that's what I meant. Got it.
So one of the cases I want to talk about is symbolic regression. This is sort of its own subfield within genetic programming, one of the common problems. And it is focused on creating executable expressions. So, right, we can take a mathematical expression and turn it into a tree, and we sort of have these rules of internal nodes are operators and leaf nodes are either inputs or constants. And the interesting thing about symbolic regression is, we can put whatever functions or operators we want. And so a common thing is to have one of those internal nodes be something like an if less than. And so this would be evaluated as if A is less than B, return whatever the C branch evaluates to, otherwise return whatever the D branch evaluates to. But because we're following the rules of the grammar, this is an internal node, and this, well, it could be a whole branch that ends in leaves. We can do whatever swapping back and forth we want. And so what we have is a framework that stores a lot of these structures. Okay? And so the idea is an individual is represented as a tree. And for symbolic regression, typically it's sort of like regression. We have a data set that we want to apply it to. So as a sort of silly example, here's a data set. I've got input variables x1 through whatever xn, and then some sort of an output value that I want to predict or I want to model. And so my goal is to find some function of those input variables that accurately predicts y. Make sense? So from an evolutionary standpoint, what I'm going to do, I'll back up, is create a whole population of thousands of these tree structures. And then I'm going to evaluate each tree structure by running it against this data. So here's my data. Here's my tree structure. I'll call it F1. And then I compare it to the actual answer I want and look at the error, and that error, and often it's a root mean squared error or something similar, becomes the fitness for the tree structure that represents function 1. And then the same thing, individual 2, which is function 2, generates a bunch of outputs, calculate the difference, that gives me its error and its fitness. And so I have a whole bunch of trees, and for each of these trees, calculate the error, and that becomes the fitness. And now I can apply the idea of selection based on fitness and crossover and reproduction and so forth. And eventually, hopefully, I'll come up with a tree that does a good job of predicting the output. Questions?
Yeah, Terry, what was F1 and F2 again?
So F1 is the function represented by the first tree in my population.
Oh,
So
I see. Okay.
Right, my tree is a function, and so F1 is that first tree in the population. So here, let's do an example. Here's some Python. Is that showing up? Good. Okay. And it's probably much too small to read. I apologize. But this is a genetic program. So here's the Python code on the left. You all saw that, right? Okay. And I'll hit run. And let's see. I got to move some windows here a little bit. So this is running the program. And it's doing this process. It's generating these expression trees. It's comparing them, each one against a set of data to see how well it predicts the outcome, using that error to generate the fitness, and then doing selection and crossover and so forth. Right at the moment, the initial population size, I think, is, I'm going to forget, 5,000 of these trees. So right now it's evaluating all 5,000 trees against a data set, and it's going to take a little while, but it is running the file. What you see above it, I ran it a moment ago. There we go. So this is the best tree that it came up with. It's not drawn as a tree, it's drawn as an expression, and you can see it's got the input variables v1 plus v2 times V5 plus V4 and then some constants. So this is written as an expression. Here we go. I cannot highlight it well. Let me see if I can get my, nope. So this happened to be the best expression in that first population. And it had an error. That's again, sorry, a little hard to read. This was the best individual. Its error, just in terms of difference from the correct output, was about 1600. And now this is showing every 100 generations as it goes through, and the average error for the whole population and the error of the best individual, which is getting better. And so this is running sort of in the background, this process of trial of these expression trees, do some swaps back and forth between them, remeasure their fitness, report the best one, report the average. And you can sort of see, and again, the font may be a little small to read, but the best is getting better over time. The average tends to fluctuate a lot more because you can do an exchange and suddenly end up with this terrible tree whose error is huge and it throws off the whole average. Questions? Yeah.
Terry, the average size or the average error size seems to be consistently going down though.
So the average size is the size of the expression tree, and that's also going down. So for reasons that I won't go into, well, clearly, or maybe not clearly, if you think back to my crossover example, you get trees that vary in size. And it turns out there's a whole bunch of weird evolutionary pressures basically on the size of the trees. So it's one of the things that I tend to keep track of. So yeah, often you'll see trees that get smaller and in other weird ways larger, which is a separate discussion that I'll put off for a little bit. But yeah, the size there is the size of the trees. And now I'm going to forget how many iterations I asked this to run for. Let's see, 5,000. So yeah, it's gonna be a little while before we get an answer. But you can sort of see the general process. And in the end, what it's going to do is spit out an expression that says this is an expression that does a pretty good job of fitting the data. So let me go back to my presentation.
Is there any assumption on F1 and F2?
Excuse me?
Yeah, are you putting some assumption on F1 and F2 here, or there is no assumption at all?
So basically there's no assumptions at all. It's just going through and saying, I'm gonna sort of fiddle around. I shouldn't say fiddle around. It's gonna apply this evolutionary process to all of the individuals in the population, which is to say all of the expression trees. And really it's just saying, if you have a smaller error, then you're more likely to be selected. And so,
quick question, Terry. Do you ever get stuck in parameter space? Do you incorporate jumps to bounce around at all?
Yes. In my simple example, you know, the Python code I'm running now, no, but absolutely the population of solutions will converge and get stuck. And so there are, you know, dozens of different techniques to avoid that. Some of them are just, you know, once all of the population has a very similar fitness, start over from scratch, or randomly generate some more individuals. There's lots of different things that are done to sort of maintain that balance between, I want a diverse population, but also one that continually improves. And I should say, this is, you know, a very standard problem, right? Linear regression has been around forever. And if I were to say, I only have one variable, x1, and my output f1, and I assume it's a linear relationship between them, using evolutionary computation or genetic programming to find that linear relationship would be ridiculous, right? Just do linear regression and find it. Symbolic regression, sort of as a technique for looking at data like this, is expensive computationally, and tends only to really be better than the alternatives in cases where, for example, you have lots and lots of input variables, a lot of which are irrelevant. And so it tends to do a pretty good job of filtering out the irrelevant variables that you might not know about. It has the advantage that you can put in things like conditional statements. So if you have a reason to expect that the output is based on conditional statements, for example, or maybe the relationship is based on something weird like sines and cosines, that more traditional methods don't work well, that's when you would want to shift to something like symbolic regression. It also has the advantage that in theory, not always in practice, what you get as a result is one often fairly large expression tree that, at least in theory, you can look at and figure out what it means. So some of you may be saying, oh, I have this problem all the time and I use random forest and it gives really low errors. And that's true. Random forest, for example, is a good alternative technique. But of course, what you end up with is a solution that is a forest of sort of sub-solutions that it's very hard to analyze. So arguably, this isn't always the case, but it's often the case, symbolic regression gives you a more understandable solution. Good. Questions? Okay, so let me do another example. Symbolic regression is one form of evolutionary computation. I'm going to do another example from the realm of artificial life. And some of you may be familiar with this. This has been a problem that sort of the Deacon has been studying for quite a while. And this is actually some work I did with it quite a while ago. And it turns out that hyenas will gang up to chase lions away from a kill. Individually, lions are much stronger than hyenas. And so the hyenas have to coordinate their attack to sort of be able to gang up on the lions. And so this becomes an interesting question in terms of how do you get the appropriate cooperation that the hyenas will coordinate their behavior to attack well. And this is something that we can tackle using genetic programming by taking the hyena behavior and representing it as a program. So I have sort of a typical prototype example. My little brown dots here are hyenas. The red dot is a kill, so I guess like a zebra carcass, sorry, but yeah, that's what it would be. And then a couple of lions. And I'm sort of representing these circles, the big yellow circles, and this will be clearer when I run some examples. The radius around the lions where, for example, the hyenas are in danger. And so the idea would be a bunch of hyenas have to get together to chase away the lions. And what I would like, at least, is to come up with appropriate hyena behavior. But I want to allow that to evolve. So I'm looking at this as an evolutionary question. How can hyenas evolve behaviors that allow them to attack lions? And so we need a representation, and this is, again, a case where sort of a representation that is in some sense a program makes sense. And so I have a very simple example where our leaf nodes are inputs that are, for example, vectors. So a hyena knows where the next nearest hyena is. or it knows where the next nearest calling hyena is. So one of the things that happens when hyenas gang up on lions is they all start yipping. And so you could say, well, where's a hyena that's yipping versus which one is next to me? And then we can put in operators if these are vectors, like invert that vector, or add two vectors together, or if one vector is shorter than another, make some decision about how you should behave. And so in general, we're going to get, and I apologize, let me pull up once again my laser pointer. I forgot to turn it back on. There we go. So we're going to get fairly large trees that represent programs in the sense that they have input vectors to things in the environment, and then vector operations that could be add vectors or invert vectors, or check if one vector is smaller than another one or greater than another one. Make sense? So just to explain the problem a little bit, the lions do not evolve. They are sort of pre-programmed with the simple lion model. Stick near the zebra. If a hyena gets close, the hyena is hurt. In this case, that would be negative fitness. And then if the hyenas outnumber a lion by more than 5 to 1, no, excuse me, by more than 3 to 1, the lion will move away. And that's within 5, so that's this yellow circle. So if I have 4 hyenas that are within 5 of a lion, the lion will move away from them. It gets scared off. And sort of the hyena model is based on fitness. So hyenas get fitness for being close to the zebra, and they lose fitness for being close to a lion if they're too close. So basically, they get points for approaching the zebra, they get penalized for getting close to the lion, and that's it. So there isn't any real fitness for scaring the lions away, except indirectly. If they can scare the lions away, then they can get close to the zebra without sort of taking damage. And really, this fitness is added up at every time step. So what we're going to see is a simulation that runs over time, and the hyenas are moving around and the lions are moving around. And so every time step, they get a little bonus for being close to the zebra if they're close, and they get a penalty for being close to the lions if they're far away. And then the other rule that I put in is hyenas that are close enough to the zebra do some sort of a calling. And that's a built-in rule. That one's not evolved. So a lot of this comes down to the hyena inputs, and on the interest of time, I won't go over this in too much detail. There were some that I was experimenting with. What kind of inputs help coordinate behavior? But the important ones are sort of, where's the nearest neighbor to me? Where's the nearest lion? Where's the zebra, if they're close enough to see it? And then some other things like which direction is north, because maybe that's important to cooperate. There's a constant in there that's a tree stump. So let me just jump ahead a little bit to the results, and tested this before and it worked fine. So let's see. Now, of course, it's not going to.
Is this your video, Terry?
Yep.
Remember you had to switch which screen you were sharing?
Yes. Except it's not popping up on any of my screens because I have the laser pointer, so it doesn't want to connect to it.
Well,
so let me see if I can do it a different way. Otherwise, I'll just go and find the. There we go. Does everybody see this nice little video window? Excellent. So this is early on. generations 10 and 20 from some different trials. I'm going to pause really quickly to point out what's going on. The red circle in the middle is the zebra. The yellow circles, and Barry is laughing at my prototype, which as always is all circles and none of the cool graphics you get in a game studio. The yellow circles are the lions. This green thing is a stump that the hyenas can see and maybe use as a coordination point. And then the brown circles are the hyenas running around. If they get close to the lion, they take damage. If they get inside this brown circle, they see the zebra and start calling, and you won't hear that. Out here, they can't see the zebra. And what we'll see is not very much. And this is early in the evolutionary process, not a whole lot going on. There is a little bit of move in to get closer to the zebra, but then they tend to stop, right? Much too dangerous to get any closer to the lions. And you do get these interesting behaviors like I just got close enough and now I'm going to move away and then I'm going to move closer, and that keeps an average distance without accidentally getting attacked by a lion and that sort of thing. And then I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here. So this is what, over 1,000 generations in. There we go. So I've run this, and all we're doing is looking, selecting individuals, groups of hyenas that do a good job. And we've done this now for what, 1,400 iterations. And they've figured out, learn is a tricky word to use. They've evolved behaviors that do let them push the lions away. Although we always get a few weird flukes in there. This is an interesting case I might come back to.
So is this cooperation, Terry?
So yeah, I would definitely say this is cooperation.
And do they lose anything by cooperating? Do they get less of the zebra the more of them there are?
No. So in this case, the fitness is just based on how close they get. So it doesn't include sort of the proper social hierarchy of the dominant zebra gets, excuse me, the dominant hyena gets more of the zebra. What is included in here that I didn't talk about, but turned out to be fairly important, there's one, I gotta find it, purple hyena. There we go. This one here, I'm not sure if it shows up well. I'll call her Sally because hyenas are matriarchal. And the only difference about Sally is that when she gets inside the brown circle and starts calling, that is a unique input. So a given hyena can see their nearest neighbor. They can see the nearest hyena that's inside the circle and calling. So for example, pick one. This hyena could see that one, which is its nearest neighbor, and that one, which is its nearest neighbor that's calling, but it can also always see Sally. And it turned out that is made cooperation much easier to evolve. And Sally is not a leader. She doesn't give any commands. I'd sometimes use the term flag bearer because she's got that big battlefield flag that everybody can see. And if you watch closely, a lot of the hyenas won't move now that we've evolved for a while until she gets inside the circle. And in this one odd case I mentioned, she doesn't get inside the circle and therefore none of them move. So there's a little bit of that notion of hierarchy built in, but not all of the sharing of resources.
So I have a question, Terry. So do the lions then respond to like how many hyenas or like how close they get? Because like sometimes there's like a bunch of hyenas in the brown circle, but the lions still stay.
Right. So, yep. It has to be at least 4 hyenas within the lion's yellow circle.
Okay.
And if it's less than 4, the lion won't move and the hyena just takes damage, basically. It loses fitness because it's close enough to be clawed at, basically.
Gotcha, that makes sense.
As soon as there's 4 or more, the lion will immediately start moving away.
Okay. So the hyenas don't get any sort of fitness bonus for there being more hyenas close to them, though, do they? No. Okay. Interesting.
Well, they get it only very indirectly in that if there are more that are close to the lion, then they can all go to the zebra without being hurt. But it's a very indirect process. There's no, you get rewarded for moving the lions.
And is the stump important?
It has a very small impact on their ability to evolve cooperation. So if Sally isn't present, then the stump can be slightly helpful. Just because it gives them sort of another point. And what you'll notice is that when I was running these experiments, it was placed randomly. I suspect that if it was always in the same place, it might become more useful. But really, it's just a reference point. So a lot of what I was interested in with this work was sort of what shared information helps cooperation evolve. And the other thing that's sort of interesting here is a lot of the selection was done not just on individual hyenas, but on whole groups of hyenas. So one of the nice things about doing computer simulations is you can sort of make up your own rules. And so I could take a team of, I forget how many this is, I think it's 15 hyenas, and treat that as a single organism and say, I'm going to copy all 15 genes, all 15 genomes into the next generation. And that certainly helps cooperation evolve. So basically it's group selection enforced by doing it on a computer. And that is helpful for cooperation. Good. And actually, let me go back to my slides. So the idea for genetic programming.
Terry, can I ask you a quick question?
Yes. There we go.
What about the number of hyenas? Did you do the problem where you have 5 or 8 or 10 or 15 and see how the ones may differ? Because obviously, as Holly pointed out, the rewards differ to real hyenas.
Right.
Hunting in a pack of 5 is a much bigger reward than 50.
Yep. And so the answer is I did.
Have you worked on that part of the problem?
No. I mean, that's certainly a next step. And one of the ways to do that that's sort of interesting, and this shades over into the game studio a little bit, is in a sense saying a pack of hyenas has a limited number of resources to divide amongst its members, which is, right, the zebra. And then you get that trade-off. Do I want 5 or 20? But I haven't done that. One of the things that's tricky there, I expect you would see, is fluctuation. So initially, excuse me, if you allow the pack size to evolve, it will probably evolve to be bigger and bigger, just so that through random chance, you're more likely to be, a pack is more likely to be successful. Once they've evolved a successful behavior, then they can start trimming the members down so that they each get a bigger reward.
Yeah, another thought that jumps into my mind is a cost, energetic cost of how long it takes them.
Right.
Right, there's that's another dimension of this problem in the real world.
Yep, for sure. And all of those can be put in fairly easily. part of what, the problem that I run into, Barry can probably attest to this, is that there are so many of those, it's hard to focus on one and get finished. Tend to get sidetracked. But yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And both of those, and then sort of coming back to Holly's point, not only do you want to be able to vary the pack size, but you really want to be able to put in some of the hierarchical nature of hyena packs where the dominant individuals get a much more of the reward.
So with the windmill problem, do you have a fixed number of windmills?
So you can do it either way. So you can say, I don't know how many windmills are optimal, and then you have to put in a sense, a special mutation operator that says add a windmill or remove a windmill. What becomes a little tricky then is if you've got two individuals and one is 50 windmills and one is 10 windmills and you want them to be parents, how do you have them exchange information?
And so the other question is, what if a windmill lands on another windmill? Does that take both of them out, or too close to, even if not on, too close to?
Right. So and that's a standard problem of sort of, I have a solution that's in some ways invalid. And there are generally sort of two approaches. One is to look at a way to repair it. Excuse me. So I have two windmills that are too close. I'm just going to arbitrarily move them apart and make those the new values in the genome. The other one is just to say they're too close together. I'm going to put in a big fitness penalty and let evolution do the rest of the work. And depending on the sort of the circumstances, one or the other of those solutions works better. But that's one of the big issues in evolutionary computation in general, and especially in genetic programming, is this idea of I'm trying to search for the best solution. And my space of solutions is in some sense divided into valid solutions, and then maybe there's a whole bunch of invalid ones where two windmills are on top of each other. And I'd like to avoid searching that invalid space as much as possible, because that's just wasting resources. And so in part, you try and come up with representations that don't allow it. That whole notion of creating tree structures where crossover is always going to give me a valid solution. And in part, you do things like, I'm going to have a repair operator.
And does anybody ever compare these solutions, like, so the windmill problem, for example, compare the solutions that the windmill problem comes up with when you evolve it versus what some engineer comes up with, and say, which one of these is better?
Yes. So comparisons to human solutions are not as common. There's a lot of work comparing to other machine learning solutions. I think there's a question in the chat about that. For symbolic regression, Jason Moore, who I think some of you will recognize the name, wrote a paper just a couple years ago comparing a bunch of different genetic programming symbolic regression techniques to non-evolutionary symbolic regression techniques. It was pretty interesting. See you, Craig. In terms of comparing it to human engineers, that happens less often. The example that comes to mind, Greg Hornby, who works for NASA, has done a lot of work evolving the structures for antennas that go on satellites. Traditionally, it's, I don't know, an antenna engineer who does that. And he evolved better solutions. And so there are several NASA satellites whose antennas were evolved. You're muted.
The evolutionary program evolved better solutions?
Yes.
And then they made them?
And they put them on satellites, and NASA is using them today.
And they are better solutions.
Yes. So here, yes, that, right? Except in the teeny window, nobody could see the back of my shirt. Oh, well, okay. I'll do that later. Yeah, so pretty traditionally, if it's a problem that people have worked on for a long time, usually the human developed solutions are pretty good. James Foster had a student, I'll say decades ago, who tried to evolve two-stroke engines. So the design of an engine, and after a few very humorous failures, came up with a solution that was basically identical to what human engineers do, and to optimize the trade-off between horsepower and efficiency. I know of another case, also antennas, interestingly enough, evolving the, I think it was the Wi-Fi antenna to go in portable devices, or maybe it was the Bluetooth antenna in like our phones. So there's a little mini antenna in there to broadcast and receive Wi-Fi, and they did some work evolving those antennas. And that was an interesting experiment, in part because part of the fitness function was your antenna is not allowed to look like these other shapes because those have already been patented. And so part of the fitness function was not only optimize broadcast and receive sort of signal strength, it included don't do these things because those have been done. Question in the chat about how long genetic programming has been studied. So evolutionary computation has been around for a long time. I think there were some very simple examples like in the 40s that were not even programmed. It was people sort of thinking about the idea of using evolution to optimize solutions. Genetic programming, I think the mid-80s was when we first saw people trying to evolve executable structures. Somebody asked, why did I use Python instead of something faster like C or Julia? So usually I do use C, or at least C++. I did the symbolic regression example specifically on Python because I know that has more appeal to most of the people in sort of IBEST and BCB. So I wanted to say very explicitly, if you're interested in trying it, we have a version in Python that you can build on, because I know that's what, I think that's what most people are comfortable with. Good. What is the benefits of genetic programming compared to other machine learning solutions? So genetic programming, and I think I'm going to stop sharing here, at least for now. Genetic programming tends to be good when your solution space is sort of so wide open you don't really have any better technique. And that is, I mentioned that for symbolic regression, where it's particularly true. It's sort of the evolutionary approach is usually the last resort. But that is often where we are. So I have no clue about what machine learning technique would be appropriate for getting hyenas to cooperate. But I'm pretty confident that evolution will do it. And luckily I was right. You know, it may be slower, but in the long run, it should be successful. So that, I think, is the short answer there.
So Terry, what do you consider the biggest advance in the field in the last 5 years?
Oh, that's a terrible question, because I've been, chair for 3 years now, so I have no clue what advances have been made. So in like genetic programming, or?
Yeah, in genetic program, evolutionary.
Evolution in general?
No, well, not evolution in general, evolutionary programming. Evolutionary
programming, right. So sadly, I'm a little out of touch to say what the biggest advances are. So the first thing that springs to mind, and this sounds a little odd, but just a little more of a controlled approach. So I mentioned Jason Moore's paper sort of looking at symbolic regression techniques compared to more traditional statistics techniques. And that was a pretty exhaustive paper in terms of the data sets that he used. And that's in some ways a depressingly new thing. If you go back 5 years, what you see are lots of papers where I took an existing evolutionary technique and I tweaked it and I tested it on 5 problems and my results are a little bit better, which is kind of cool, but not very informative.
But incremental.
But very incremental. And I think now people are doing a better job of trying to set the field in sort of within all of the other fields.
Cool.
And then another, again, not so much a scientific advance, but there is a lot more easy to use libraries being developed. Part of that, I think, is the popularity of Python. So there were certainly good genetic programming libraries for, say, C around for a long time, or C++. But a good C++ library only gets so much usage, whereas a good Python library these days is much more popular.
Terry, I mean, I don't know what the protocol is for Zoom meetings because like we're over time, but anybody who can leave and feels like leaving can leave at any time. So I don't know what you want to do if, to wind this down, but.
So I'll say I scheduled for at least an extra half hour. So I'm fine being here till 2 answering questions. I guess as people who don't have questions should certainly feel free to leave. Maybe I'll reiterate this notion that I did some of this in Python explicitly with the idea that if people are interested, I've got code to share and go through. So yeah, come bug me. As Barry said, I like to collaborate. Other questions? Suppose if people are here, I could show the Unity version. You didn't get a chance to see that, Barry.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to show the Unity thing if, so do that.
So let me see if I can get it to show up. There we go. So this is sort of like the lions and hyenas, but doing it sort of as an all at once. So it's going to be a huge mess that I'll have to explain. Let me pause. Yeah, there, that's a huge mess. So each of the dots represents, think of it as a hyena, if you will. Similarly colored dots are part of the same pack. So these are pack sizes of 5. And can you see my mouse when I?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so that should be a pack. The smaller green dots are food. And there are some red squares that don't stand out so well that move around and drop food behind them. I guess the best analogy would be maybe a whale. So, right, whales, as they swim along and suddenly excrete, which is a huge food source for microorganisms. I like
hyenas.
What?
I'm pretty sure hyenas do not exploit that food source, but
no, they right. So yeah, so the nice thing about biology is no matter what ridiculous thing I put down, there's some example from biology that maps to it. So yeah, think of these as whales and these as groups of, I don't know, teams of microorganisms. And so it's similar to the hyena problem. The individuals have these input vectors. So they know, for example, where a whale is, they know where food is, and they're sharing the resources. So whatever they collect goes into their team. And so if I unpause this, you can see them moving around, most of them fairly foolishly, and this is only a teeny piece of it. So, right, you zoom out. lots of things going on. Here's our whales, and they're leaving some food behind, and at least some individuals have happened to come up with this random, I'm going to follow those food sources around. Other individuals, typically, I think this is a group of them, have instructions that involve things like going to food.
So do the clusters now get bigger as they consume food?
So
that one looks like it's getting bigger.
What happens is a team gets bigger. So if a team of 5 individuals collects enough food, all 5 individuals reproduce. And so it's a little weird in that these sort of pale individuals, some of the team members may be here, but these may be other team members that are just really dumb. And so when they collect enough food, these team members also get to reproduce. So it's a very communistic model right at the moment.
So you're having the dumb team members reproduce when the smart ones collect food?
Yep, because they're all sharing that resource. But what will happen as they reproduce and mutate is teams that have more smart individuals will eventually get better. Sorry, Gary, go ahead.
Actually, no, I've decided I retract what I said.
What did you say? I missed it.
No way. No, I think enough people heard it and think ill of me now.
Okay. But yeah, I mean, if it runs long enough, you will end up with a case where there's a team that has 3 smart members and a team with only 2 smart members, and the team with 3 smart members will do a better job of collecting food. And you tend to end up, I haven't done a lot with this yet, with teams where some of the members, and maybe this is a case, I'm not positive, right? We see some light green individuals that are chasing the food source and just picking up some food by chance, and the rest gets left behind. But I was thinking, nope, maybe I'm wrong, that there were some other light green members that were going after food. So you do sometimes see teams where some members chase the food source and other members stay behind to sweep up what got missed. And I haven't been playing with this for very long. I sort of putted up in part thinking about this presentation. So immediately you can go into the, right, well, what if we distribute the food differently? What if we let the team sizes change? What if we let them attack each other instead of just having to go after the green dots?
So what happens if they don't collect enough food?
So this is an energy-based model. So they're using up a little bit of energy every time step. And if the team runs out of energy, they all die together. And they use more energy the faster they move. So at least early on, you'll often see a lot of individuals not moving at all, and they'll just sit there for a while because it takes them a lot longer, basically, to starve.
So if part of the team is moving and collecting food, and the other part is just sitting, when they run out of energy, do the sitting ones and the moving ones all disappear at the same time?
Yep,
oh,
simultaneously.
Okay. So they can't have a strategy of having somebody just hanging out for when the active guys bite the dust.
Right. Although it is true, I mean, in the sense that if you have I'll say a stupid individual, it's better to have a stupid individual that doesn't move at all versus one that like goes running off for the horizon, which is unevolvable behavior. Because then not only is it not getting food, but it's wasting a bunch of energy.
Using a lot of energy, yeah, interesting.
Yeah, so, I mean, depending on your model, I'm talking about 5 individuals as a team, and we're thinking about it like 5 hyenas, but that somehow share food. Maybe it's more like 5 cells that are part of one organism. They're just not connected cells, but they share their resources.
Interesting. That's pretty fun.
Yeah. Well, and this is, I mean, personally, this is my problem, is it's fun and I'll play with it a long time, but I didn't necessarily start with that good research hypothesis that allows me to say, oh, and now I've learned something I can publish. So.
You could just say, this is fun.
Yeah.
I got a couple of questions, Terry, if you're
yeah.
still around. So when genomes evolve, sometimes you can get duplications of genes that diverge into new functions.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that in code? Do you get, chunks of code that, is that even possible in this evolution, simulation type thing?
Let me think about that for a minute.
So, a block of code gets duplicated and then independently evolve or whatever.
So what does happen a lot, which is not quite what you're talking about because the mechanism isn't built in, is you'll get a population of a lot of individuals that are fairly similar. And then when you do crossover, you end up crossing a block that already exists. So you will get an individual that has two similar blocks because it inherited, in a sense, two copies. So that does happen fairly often. It's not quite the same thing as a duplication event. It's more of a, I'm not sure of quite the right analogy, but yeah, you do often see duplicated blocks.
I guess.
Go ahead.
No, go for it. I had another question too.
No, please.
Well, so it's not really related to evolution. I was wondering is if this works for optimizing code. So if you take like, some program and let it evolve with a goal in mind, say like faster runtimes or something, could you apply this kind of thing to just making code better or making code do something else? Without having to, go through it and reduce loops or whatever, like manually.
Yeah, there's a couple of research groups that are looking sort of at doing this as unapplied. So some are doing it looking at optimizing code, others trying to reduce vulnerabilities in code. And I'm just not enough up on the literature to say sort of how successful those techniques are on a practical scale. I certainly know that they've shown that they can say, here's some non-optimized code for a series of nested loops, and we can apply these techniques and optimize it. But what I don't know is, it takes all weekend of evolution to optimize it, and a decent programmer could do it in 5 minutes.
Sure, yeah.
One interesting case where I think it has been a little more effective is looking at creating code for quantum computers, which only sort of exist yet. I don't know how familiar you are with quantum computing. The main thing to know about it is because it uses quantum effects, it's pretty non-intuitive. So it's really hard to think about the way that quantum computers do parallel calculations. And because it's difficult for people, it's a good application for an evolutionary technique.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.